Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. I realized a long time ago that the climate debate was not about the science of climate, but rather about the science of propaganda. We are constantly inundated with fake news from the government and the press. Like the week before the 2016 election when pollsters said Hillary Clinton was going to win by 20 points. I grew up in the 1960s surrounded by fake news about JFK, the war in Vietnam, and many assassinations of prominent figures that decade. 1 month after the JFK assassination, Harry Truman, who created the CIA, said, "For some time I've been disturbed by the way the CIA has been diverted from its original assignment. It has become an operational and at times a policy-making arm of the government. This has led to trouble." Fast forward to 1980. The Republican establishment was trying to get rid of Ronald Reagan, and the Democrat establishment was trying to brand him as being a racist. The polls showed Jimmy Carter defeating Ronald Reagan in a huge landslide. But Reagan won almost every state. The Republican establishment accepted Reagan after he agreed to take George Bush, a former CIA director, as his vice president. Then in February 1981, President Reagan was interviewing candidates for the CIA head. He asked William Casey what he would do if he was director of the CIA, and Casey responded, "We'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false." Reagan apparently liked that answer. He picked Casey for CIA director, where he remained until his death in 1987. We're pretty much at that point now with nothing but fake news about every important issue. 2 weeks ago, the press was saying that Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia had doomed the climate. His refusal to go along with the Democrats' climate scam was going to be the end of the earth, as far as the New York Times was concerned. The Washington Post reported, "The U.S. plan to avoid extreme climate change is running out of time." But Manchin knuckled under to the pressure, and CNN reported his collapse as being wielding his power. Manchin said that increasing the deficit by $500 billion would lower the deficit and lower inflation. CNN reported the measure would spend nearly $370 billion on fighting climate change and developing a new green energy economy, reviving efforts that had seemed doomed just weeks ago. It would instantly transform Biden into the president who made the greatest commitment to cutting greenhouse gas emissions and would enshrine his global leadership of the effort to stave off the most disastrous future effects of climate change. It comes as extreme weather events, from drought in the American West to flooding in Kentucky that has killed at least 28 people, are ravaging the U.S. Every single sentence in this article is fake news and propaganda. The article says that Joe Biden is going to save the climate by cutting greenhouse gas emissions, and that's going to prevent bad weather like they're having this week. The reality is that Biden's plan will have no impact on greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, and it will have no impact on the weather. Let's go back to this date in 1930 when carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were much lower. 5 states were over 110 degrees Fahrenheit. 25 states were over 100, and 40 states were over 90 degrees. Weather this hot in the United States is incomprehensible to modern Americans who've never experienced anything like it. On that same date, August 2nd, 1930, there were massive floods in Japan which submerged 1,000 houses. And London was suffering severe floods as well on that same day. And this week in 1931, the deadliest flood in world history struck China. 50,000 square miles of China was underwater and millions of people died. 3 of the 5 deadliest floods in world history occurred during the 1930s. The Los Angeles Times reported, "World suffers freak weather. America has drought and heat waves. Europe suffers from rain and cold spells. Indies and China hit by heavy floods. Japan had a deadly typhoon. Greece received no rain during the summer at all. People in many U.S. states were starving due to the heat wave and drought. People in Australia were dropping like flies from the heat wave and the flu." Also in 1931, politically motivated junk science was dominating the news. 100 of Germany's top scientists wrote a pamphlet, 100 authors against Einstein. They were against him because he was Jewish. 1930 and 1931 were the two worst fire years in the United States, with more than 50 million acres burned each year. In 1945, the United States Department of Agriculture reported that on average 31 million acres of forest burns each year. But now the press claims that 10 million acres, which burned in 2020, is an all-time record. That's only 1/5 of how much burned in 1930 and 1931, and only about 1/3 of what the Department of Agriculture said was average in 1945. The 1930s brought the worst heat waves and the most extensive forest fires to the United States, but you'll never hear that from the press. All we hear from the press is this sort of baseless fake news like this article from CNN. CNN says that spending $370 billion on fighting climate change will lower greenhouse gas emissions and prevent bad weather. But it will have no measurable effect on the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and it will have no effect on the weather either. During Biden's 50 years in Washington, D.C., there's been dozens of climate bills and dozens of international climate agreements. None of these have had any impact on the growth of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which has steadily curved upwards. Based on this graph, it's very easy to predict how much CO2 there'll be in the atmosphere 1 year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now. Nothing Joe Biden or Joe Manchin are doing will have any impact on the climate, but they certainly will have an impact on energy prices and inflation. If this bill passes, Biden and Manchin will have made life more difficult for the majority of Americans. Policy in the United States is being driven by fake news and propaganda. It appears that William Casey has been successful. Everything much of the American public believes is now false. Toto's been studying the science of propaganda for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Kyrie, Caesar, Toki, and Upala on the web at realclimatescience.com.